we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week,
Lawds malarkey, Governor. Blighty's popped its clogs.
Americans have been hoovering up UK doom content ever since Elon Musk decided to push the grooming gang scandal on X at the start of the year.
On the inside, everyone understands the Notting Hill days are long gone. Only some have clocked that the Children of Men era is upon us.
Now, with the banning of a viral ad for a crypto exchange describing the dismal state of the country, we're checking in on the dismal state of the country.
Meanwhile, America is pushing India to cut its oil trade with Russia. Obviously, this will never have any bad second-order consequences.
Finally, having exposed their air defense nakedness in one wild weekend, the Iranians are in the market for a new system. The news is they're going AliExpress. Can China succeed where their own engineers failed? Watch this underground bunker.
But first,
Airstrip 0.
Well, we haven't checked in on Britain for a while. We did some shows after the election, I think, when Labour was elected, and made some pretty grim predictions. I'm sure we've checked in once or twice since then, but we haven't really done a kind of an overview. I don't think we're going to do a full British special episode or anything this time, but a recent event made, I think, both of us think that we should check back in on what's happening in Britain. The company Coinbase, the cryptocurrency, released an ad recently, and the ad basically it's kind of satirical. It's got like a musical or something vibe to it, like Mary Poppins or something like that. But it's basically an ad about British decline where, you know, it shows all these rising standard costs of living, people's houses being kind of crappy, rubbish piling up in the streets and rats everywhere. I guess that's kind of a nod toward what's happening in Birmingham with the lack of bin collection that's been there for a while. Basically portraying Britain as kind of broke and a bit miserable. And at the end of the ad, it also shows a wealthy couple getting in the car and leaving the country and going to Dubai, which also reflects something that is actually happening at the moment. The interesting thing, I suppose, the interesting thing is the ad itself. I'll get back to that. But secondarily to that, the news on the day of recording is that the British regulator has banned the ad and said it's not allowed. They've said that the ad is political, and so it's not a normal ad or something like that. I don't fully understand what I guess are probably Ofcom regulations. But the ad isn't partisan political. I suppose it's making a point about the political state of Britain or the cultural state of it or whatever. But I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the ad was banned because it was highly negative. It was a very negative view of the country, maybe seen as a bit too demoralizing or something like that. But you know, it does reflect a growing sense. I mean, the ad doesn't depict anything that you don't read about in the newspapers. The ad, to my mind, accurately reflects the mood in Britain. I mean, you'll know this if you know the country reasonably well. If you're a numbers person, you can look at a recent survey I saw that was done, maybe it was 6 weeks ago or something like that. I want to remember the numbers. I think it was 68% of people said that the country was fundamentally broken. I mean, the basic too long didn't read version of it is we were right about Britain when we said that the Starmer ministry would rein in a serious phase of decline. This was due to structural economic issues. It was also due to structural political issues and various other nasties hiding in the closet. And it's all come to pass. The country is effectively in austerity mode. The political system is fragmenting to the point that I think it is actually collapsing in on itself. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And the inflation has come down, although some people do say that, you know, the numbers aren't really accurately reflecting what's actually happening. And because wages haven't really come up, the living standard hit that people, I think, kind of thought might be temporary is increasingly looking permanent. There's also some very strange cultural dynamics that I usually wouldn't mention, but they're so weird, I think they're probably worth mentioning. Channel 4 aired a documentary about OnlyFans pornography, with like pornography scenes in it about a week or two ago. There seems to be this weird bleeding of pornography culture into the normal culture. And I know that may seem like kind of an obscure point, but that really feels to me like something has kind of fundamentally broken in the society. It seems to me like a modern, updated version of like what happens when poorer countries start to go down the toilet. And, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, prostitution increases a lot. I mean, that's what we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. That's exactly what happened. And of course, now we're in kind of a new technological day or whatever. And so we're seeing it in kind of digital space, or at least that's my interpretation of it. But if you follow, you know, if you read British newspapers or you follow kind of the general cultural this and that about what's going on there, like, you'll have noticed, and it's new and pretty disturbing. The political situation is interesting. I suppose some people will read it optimistically. I can't. I'm sorry. Maybe you can be a bit rosier than me, Andrew. But basically what's happened is, I'm sure everyone knows, that Reform has completely leapfrogged the other parties. And at the same time, Jeremy Corbyn has launched a left-wing party to challenge Labour. I'll tell you the numbers as they stand today. Reform is polling around 32%, something like that. Labour's down to about 22. The Tories are down below 20. The Lib Dems are around 15. And the rest are around 10. That's the Greens and the SNP and so on. The fact that Reform's ahead says a lot. It's providing some people with hope because they think if Farage becomes Prime Minister in 2029, is it? He'll like fix the country or something like that. I don't think that'll happen. I don't think he'll fix the country. I think he will become Prime Minister. But that is certainly, I guess, giving some people hope. One thing I'd say about that is that the political system is now definitively no longer a two-party system. And having seen a similar political dynamic take place in Ireland when I was growing up, where we switched from a two-party system to this kind of multi-party system, in my opinion, it's pretty catastrophic, and it tends to completely destroy democratic legitimacy in the country because you tend to form coalition governments and people just vote in these varying kaleidoscopic patterns and generally always get the same, which is some sort of really boring caretaker government. The Corbyn party hasn't named itself yet, as far as I know, so there's no decent polling on them. I've seen numbers anywhere from they take 10%, which is basically absorbing about 3% of Labour's share, and about most of the Green Party share. I've seen those numbers. I've also seen numbers of 18%. My sense is we don't know how popular these are going to be, but the breakdown according to party, people who voted for X party going to the Corbyn party, it seems to be Green and Labour. I think they will definitely absorb most of the Green vote. They might even absorb the party. Probably wouldn't be a bad move. And then they'll probably absorb a decent portion of the Labour vote. Will it be 3%? My feeling is it should be higher than 3% because, you know, there's a lot of Labour voters out there who are really annoyed, who are genuine Labour voters, and they're really not happy with the way things have gone under Starmer. But there's not much point in speculating about that. So generally speaking, the mood is very low. The fact that advertising is now turning to openly depict a country that's kind of collapsing is telling. This strange pornification of the mainstream culture is really disturbing, and it bodes very poorly, I think, for the future cultural state of the country. The economy's in the doldrums, and the political system is shattering into a million little pieces, basically.
It certainly feels that way. I think for foreigners, it might be difficult to comprehend just how much of a tinderbox Britain feels at the moment. It feels that we're about a spark away from raging fires of civil unrest. Just to give people a picture of what's happening, protests against asylum seeker accommodation, which started in a pretty small town called Epping, have now metastasized and are now happening all over the country. At first, the mainstream media tried to write off these protests as kind of far-right protests, the classic propaganda playbook. But now, you know, the Epping ones certainly were led primarily by concerned mothers, and they were at pains to say that they weren't far-right. You know, if you listen to interviews, they were pains to say who they voted for. It obviously wasn't far-right or even right-wing parties. They were just very concerned. what's happened and what's caused those is that, as people know, tens of thousands of asylum seekers crossed the English Channel from France to Britain in small boats because of Britain's international obligations to the 1951 European Convention of UN Convention on Refugees, and also our signatory status to the European Convention of Human Rights, and the way that takes effect in British law through the Human Rights Act of 1998, means it's extraordinarily difficult to remove anybody who's landed on these shores. And it means that people know that if they can get to Britain, they can stay, they can make it their home, they can eventually work and live here, and they can eventually bring their family across as well through the family reunification application process. This knowledge has led to an ever-increasing number. We're now up to 50, 60, even more thousand per year. And all of these people need to be accommodated while we're waiting for their applications. And again, because of the European Convention of Human Rights and British precedent, that can't be in a kind of detention centre. So they're put up in hotels, which costs the British government somewhere in the region of £5 or £6 million per day to accommodate all of these people, and are very insecure. And these hotels are dotted all around the country. As I say, a great taxpayer expense, and quite often they're housing people who are entirely unvetted, and from places like Somalia, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Syria, which we know immigrants from those places are much more likely to commit, say, sexual assaults, certainly than the native population, but even compared with other immigrant populations. And people are concerned about these hotels in their town being taken. You know, you quite often get like a small village that might have been a little weekend getaway resort, and it's got a few thousand people in it, or a few hundred people living in the village. And suddenly you've got a few hundred asylum seekers from Afghanistan living there as well, or asylum seekers from Somalia and Eritrea or North Africa. So it can be quite disturbing. And these protests are starting to spread around the country, and they're drawing in other groups of predominantly right-wing protesters as well. At the same time, you've got this ongoing process of austerity where Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is like our Secretary of the Treasury or Finance Minister in European terms, is essentially reducing the amount of spend for every tax pound raised, and mainly because it's a Labour government, they're doing that by increasing taxes. If it was a Conservative government, they would mainly do it by reducing spending, but it's the same difference. It's kind of austerity. And because of that, the economy itself is being squeezed. Growth is non-existent, or maybe there's even a bit of contraction. And that in turn is increasing the social spending going out, lowering the tax rate, which further causes a need for fiscal retrenchment. And you get this kind of ongoing vicious cycle that just gets worse and worse. We saw what happened in countries like Greece and even Italy and Portugal, where this has been done. You get this kind of slow grinding reduction in living standards until eventually you grind wages and living standards down to a point at which the economy is competitive again. And that's the process Britain's in at the moment. It's very painful, and people are upset because they see public services crumbling, they see their tax pounds going up, they see standards of living slowly being crushed with no end in sight, and it creates a febrile and dissatisfied atmosphere, I think. So into this atmosphere where there's dissatisfaction with high levels of migration, dissatisfaction with government spending on asylum seekers, and the fact that people actually feel unsafe in the towns where these hotels are, justified or not, that's how people feel. And also you've got this grinding austerity going on and a general dissatisfaction with the way the state has been administered. You also have this proliferation of political parties. In the past in Britain, you had a two-party system, but they were very broad churches. In the 1950s, the Conservative Party had 3 million members in a population of only 40 million. You know, there's real broad membership. Labour had about 1.5 million or 1 million, plus all of the trade union members whose dues went towards supporting the Labour Party and who had votes on key policy issues. So you had this like broad mass democracy. And that made the two parties truly representative of people's views and opinions and policy preferences. Made them very broad churches which had to argue and debate and settle in what were extremely lively annual party conferences, and settle on a policy platform to which they could all just about agree. It was kind of like the horse trading that goes on in Europe after elections to form coalitions. But whereas in Europe it happened after the election, in Britain it happened before the election. Now, though, the two main political parties have been reduced to a few 100,000. And what that means is that you have the parties in control of, first of all, a small number of really hardline activists. Hardline activists, that's a bit unfair, but, people who are true believers, right? Like, political party membership and political activism is no longer a mass broad event of the general population or a broad behavior of the general population. It's something that people who are really into it do. And obviously people who are really into politics and really into the Conservative Party or the Labour Party are different to the average bloke in the street. They have different views, different ideas. And that doesn't produce a representative policy platform. Added to that, you have the fact that parties don't make most of their money from annual membership dues, people paying there. If you had 3 million people paying a tenner or 20 quid a year, you might have 30 or 60 million pounds a year to spend on running your party, okay? But you don't have that now. You have 100,000 people doing it. So you need to raise the rest of the money from big, rich donors who kind of control things as well. And obviously they have very different views. So what's happening is, as you've got this dissatisfaction on multiple levels, economically, in terms of the general public administration, the quality of public services, the tax bill, the migrant situation, like all of these things are coming to a head. Like the political class has been sweeping them under the carpet for a long time. They've been ignoring the people. I think I'm right in saying for the last 7 or maybe 8 general elections, plus one referendum, the British people have voted to reduce legal migration, like drastically reduce it, and to lower to almost zero non-invited migration, i.e. asylum seekers who may or may not truly need asylum. But the political class has instead increased it over that entire 10, 20-year, 15-year period. So people are slowly getting like really angry about these matters. And you're getting this proliferation of new political parties. Now, the bigger ones are Reform, led by Nigel Farage, who everyone has heard of. You also have increasing popularity among the Green Party. It's very much a harder line socialist party than the Labour Party. They're much more progressive than the Labour Party. They're much more in favour of big economic redistribution. And they're also, of course, because of their founding roots in the 70s as, the Ecology Party, they're very much in favour of platforms like net zero and general environmental issues. And they want to go much harder and faster than the British establishment has done. And we saw at the last election, they gained a couple of seats, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the British first past the post system, it's a major breakthrough. Then you have the Liberal Democrats who are enjoying a resurgence as well. They're taking votes off both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And now you have this new Jeremy Corbyn-led party, which you mentioned. And what's happening is, as I said before, the two main parties used to be a broad church. Now, until very recently, or even now really, the Conservative Party has 2 main factions and a third faction. So the first of the main factions is what I would call the Cameroons, those who are encapsulated by David Cameron, the former Prime Minister. They're essentially Blairites, but they want slightly lower taxes than the Blairites would want and slightly lower public spending. But they're Blairites. They're centrists, they're progressive, they're liberal. They want balance in the force, right? They want a compromise. And they're just like slightly more pro-business, slightly lower tax environment than the Blairites themselves. Then you have the second major faction, which is what I would call Thatcherites, or those with a libertarian bent. And they're kind of liberals of a different sort. They're economic liberals. They're not so concerned with social issues. They're quite happy with social liberalism, in fact, as Thatcher was by and large. But they want drastically reduced state spending and drastically reduced tax and drastic deregulation. I guess the most recent avatar of that would be Liz Truss and her disastrous 40-odd days in number 10. The third and much smaller faction is a relatively new faction within the Conservative Party. It's really emerged only in the last 10 years, but more accurately in the last 6 or 7, I would say. And that's what I would call J.D. Vance conservatism. It's much more left-wing than even the David Cameron Blairites when it comes to economics. It's much more in favour of state capacity providing good public services. It's unafraid of things like tariffs and economic protectionism. It's in favour of a muscular industrial policy. It believes in reindustrialisation of the forgotten towns. And then socially, it's much more right-wing than even the libertarian wing. It's very patriotic. It has old-fashioned kind of Christian social values, I think it's fair to say. So that's the Conservative Party. And what we're seeing is that coalition is now crumbling and breaking up. Reform is essentially taking over, is in the process of taking away that libertarian wing of the Conservative Party. And whatever happens with reform, that's what they're doing. They're breaking it up. And whether you get reform merging with that wing of the Conservative Party or taking the MPs en masse or a reverse merger or whatever, that's what's happening. Now what we're starting to see is the Labour Party is going to go under a similar process of its coalition breaking up. So you've got, within the Labour Party, you've got the Blairites, who I described with David Cameron before. It's just like David Cameron, except they want slightly higher tax and slightly more public spending. And they're a bit more progressive, to be fair, as well. They're quite aggressively liberal, progressive in that metropolitan elite kind of way. The other main faction is what I would call the kind of the student socialist faction, the kind of the soft Trotskyists. And they were really driven most recently by an organization called Movement, who ultimately put Jeremy Corbyn in power as leader of the Labour Party and led to a massive surge in Labour Party membership as a kind of grassroots movement. And then the third, much smaller part of the Labour Party coalition is what's called Blue Labour, which is led by somebody called Lord Glasswell, which is, well, J.D. Vance social conservatism. I would say it's a bit more left-wing economically than J.D. Vance, but it's still pretty much the same thing. So I think what's going to happen now is if Jeremy Corbyn gets the launch of his new party right, if he nails it, he can bring on board and re-energise the movement, and he can then deprive Labour of that vote. He might also be able to bring in the Pakistani vote, the Pakistani tribal vote in Britain, which has traditionally voted en masse in a bloc for Labour. And he can drag that away because they're already showing dissatisfaction with Labour's support of Israel in the current situation between Israel and Palestine and Gaza. And if he can do that, he can turn a lot of seats into 2, 3, even 4-way marginal seats. He can bring complete electoral chaos where it's no longer clear who can win individual seats, and the margin on error for polls could lead to swings in the number of seats in Parliament by hundreds. And this kind of political instability, Philip, I think is a classic example of what happens when states really start to break down, it's not just that the government is seen as illegitimate, it's not just that people think that the government needs to be voted out, that they've made mistakes. It's that the entire state, like the entire elite, start to lose legitimacy. You get all these proliferation of parties, like this kind of political instability where nobody knows what happens. Britain's had more prime ministers than the last few years than Italy, which used to be a paragon of cycling through political leadership and political instability. But that's what Britain's doing now. And I think it's going to continue because there is no plan to address migration numbers, either illegal or uninvited. There is no plan other than the Treasury brain, Rachel Reeves austerity plan and the slow grind downward in living standards. There's no real serious plan or any understanding of how to deal with public services. There's no serious plan with how to deal with increased crime. You know, you can go on Twitter and look at shoplifting in Britain and see that's reaching epidemic levels, or phone theft, or any of these things. So this is just going to continue grinding on and grinding on. The next election is going to be bitter. It's going to be hard fought. It's going to be chaotic in a way that I don't think that Britain has experienced for at least 100 years, but probably more like 200. And who's to know what will come of it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good overview. I'd just really quickly say what's probably going to come out of the next election is reform leading some sort of a government. I mean, I know we're quite a while out, but just even looking at the trajectory and so on. But the issue is that there's no plan, actually. You said that there's no plan currently. That's true. That's 100% true. The country's on autopilot. People are kind of starting to stop caring. That's like, the stopping caring is like the sign where it's like, that's getting really, really bad. I mean, people at every level in society are starting to stop caring. But the real issue, I think, is that reform does not actually have any plans. The slightly unfortunate thing about the debate on the right in Britain is that basically there was no debate. And reform latched onto pretty much a singular issue, which is immigration. And that's what they're running on, basically. Probably some vague Thatcherite economic promises, but they won't go anywhere. Some people in the party want to break up the deep state, pull a kind of a Trump-Vance kind of thing on that. Let them try, but I don't think it'll get very far for two reasons. Number one, it actually didn't get that far with Trump. That whole thing's already over now. And number two, the British deep state, if you want to call it that, you just call it the civil service really, is way more deeply embedded than the American one. I just don't think there's any moving that. So what'll probably end up happening is reform will get in some way. Then they'll move to clean up the immigration situation. But the moment that they do that, the Treasury guys in grey suits will come up to them and say, the economy is only ticking along due to immigration. There's no productivity growth. It's all labour force growth, and all the labour force growth is coming from migration. Literally all of it. You can go and look at this population figures. Domestic population growth is stagnant. I think it may even be in decline by the time we reach the next election cycle. And so they'll say to them, you will get worse economic outcomes if you shut off the immigration, and the austerity will get worse because these people bring in tax revenue when they do the jobs, when they come here. And so that's the choice that will be offered to reform. My bet is, faced with that choice, they will do immigration reform around the edges. They'll try and clamp down on migrant housing, like you talked about, minor issues of maybe public safety in towns or something like that where they got votes. But it'll make not a great deal of difference to the overall national picture. They'll probably keep the general rates of migration high. And basically, these are the wages. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but Britain's been unwilling to look itself in the mirror for, 20 years at least, 10, but probably 20. The elite policymakers, everybody has been unwilling to look itself in the mirror and say, what are the problems in this country? From low birth rates to stagnant business dynamics to overweening London finance sector dominance to addiction to migration, which is highly unpopular. It wouldn't look at itself in the mirror in any of these things. And the elite are out of touch, and they're obsessed with international issues, Ukraine. A lot of these people still think they have a serious say on the international stage. They don't. They're, to the extent that they ever get to pipe up, it's because they're being used by somebody else, usually the Americans, to do something or other. But, a lot of them are really invested in this because it gets them invited to the glitzy parties, and it gets, America to occasionally pay attention to them, which, they value, I guess. So that's the kind of situation. I think the situation over the next 10 years for Britain is going to be really bad, and I'm not surprised that wealthy people are leaving. The smart money's leaving, to be honest. You can just go and look at the figures. Look at the millionaire per capita emigration rates, and it's just like, it's Britain, and then the next largest one is like, a fifth the size, a tenth the size, something like that. And that's the tax base, by the way. That's also a large portion of the tax base that's leaving. So bad times, not much on the horizon really there, I'd say. But we'll check in again to see what's going on. But not great.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add one more thing to that, I think you're 100% right about reform from what I've seen. I'm kind of agnostic whether it would be a good or bad thing. It's not that I'm a fan or a hater, but the point with reform is that they don't have any plans. The last time they released a policy, it was on energy policy, and it was atrocious. It was embarrassingly amateurish. It was like actually disgraceful for any party with ambitions to govern the country to release something like that. It was just a disgrace, I thought. And they show no signs of having any plans at all. I mean, just to give you one example, even if all they wanted to do is focus on stopping the flow of small boats crossing the channel, okay? That's all they wanted to do. That's all they wanted to achieve. Well, to do that, really, as it stands, Britain either needs to leave the European Convention of Human Rights or change the way that it takes effect in English law and legislate something new to allow them to remove people, I guess, to a third country, which needs negotiating, like the Rwanda deal, or to some kind of offshore processing under British control somewhere. But to leave the European Convention of Human Rights, to be able to achieve that and provide a deterrent that actually you're not going to get into Britain and we're just going to reject your application, you're going to end up in some island on the middle of the Atlantic or in a room in Rwanda or something like that, so you can't come across in the channel. To do that, you've got to leave the ECHR. And once you leave the ECHR, you start reopening international treaties, because there's more than one international treaty to which Britain is a party, which has membership of the European Convention of Human Rights as a kind of a prerequisite to this treaty. So the first thing that you would open is the Good Friday Agreement, which was what achieved peace in Northern Ireland between the nationalists, the IRA, Sinn Féin and the rest, and the unionists, the INLA and all the others. So, you'd have to reopen that. And that means negotiate with Ireland, which means negotiate with the European Union. And at the same time, you'd have to renegotiate the trade deal that we've got with the European Union, because that has ECHR membership within it. And the EU is clearly going to use that to try to extract concessions. Why wouldn't they? I would hope they would if I was a citizen of the EU. So what? Where's the plan for this? Where's the plan for the legislation that you're going to write? Where's the plan to deal with the fallout? But there's no sign. And people say, oh, well, the election's 4 years away. Well, it might be, or Labour could call it early. And besides, there's no indication that they might be thinking of a plan. They're making lots of noise, but there's nothing like Project 20. I mean, there's nothing even on that one issue, let alone something like Project 2025 that the Trump administration could have referred to as a kind of a roadmap. So I'm just saying that there's nothing really on the horizon, and you now have timorous professors from universities in London saying that they genuinely think that the chances of civil war in Britain in the next 10 years are bigger than 50-50. You have the chance of serious civil order breaking down is now being discussed within the security deep state of Britain. This is now filtering through finally to Westminster and Whitehall, that there's a chance of serious civil unrest. We've got years of austerity, and in all of this, the big hope, reform, Nigel, odds are that they'll probably fail unless there are some big changes in their attitude and their policy platform. So what happens if they're voted in on this popular wave and they fail? Do you go to mass apathy and a retreat to personal and family life? Do you go to looking for somebody farther away from the centre? And who is that? It really doesn't look so good for Britain. And as you say, people are leaving, smart money is leaving, and you're getting a lot more censorship. People are trying to censor what's out there. Like the elite are finally starting to panic, and they're trying to put a lid on this. And I'm not saying this from a partisan way. I'm saying it because it's happening. Of course, I have my own views, and people who follow me on Twitter can listen to those. But what I'm saying here is fact. This is happening, and it's happening like this. I'm not passing judgment whether it's good or bad, but things are looking bad for Britain at the moment, and I guess we'll check in another 3 or 4 months, and hopefully we'll be proved wrong, Philip Pilkington.
Goodness gracious G.
big news in tariffs this week was, of course, Donald Trump's threat to whack huge secondary tariffs on both China and India if they continued buying oil for them evil Ruskies. And both India and China have rejected Trump's efforts to push them into ending their oil trade with Russia for various reasons. This is all over social media, but I think it's quite important, actually, and I think what we should do is look at this from a different angle. A week or so ago, maybe a bit more than that when people listen to this, we're recording a few days in advance, a former Indian ambassador, a career Indian diplomat who served in various states of the former Soviet Union and also places like Seoul and Germany, and eventually reached the rank of ambassador. M.K. Badrakumar, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, so I'm very sorry to any of my Hindi-speaking friends, but M.K. Badrakumar writes a regular blog that I call the Indian Punchline, which I visit occasionally to find what the kind of Indian elites are saying on foreign policy. And he wrote recently that, in fact, it was India that was nixing, or India that was soft peddling, or being the kind of the bulwark against efforts within the BRICS to develop their own currency and payment systems. Russia and indeed China really wanted to push forward with this, according to Badra Kumar. And what happened was India was extremely concerned that BRICS would end up looking like a kind of an anti-Western organization. In other words, India was concerned that BRICS would end up becoming de facto exactly what the West accuses it of. Whereas in fact, from India's perspective, and I think from Brazil's perspective, and originally probably from China and Russia's perspective as well, it was just a forum similar to the G7, but which emerging economies of a certain type that were large, had pretty big economies, either on the cusp of or approaching, reaching kind of developed economy status, could discuss and further their interests. And we've said many times on this podcast, Philip, that BRICS is not an alternative to NATO. It's not an alternative to the United Nations. It's more like the G7, a kind of talking shop where things can be discussed and agreed that are in their mutual interests. So, you know, the Russians have been trying to develop an alternative payment system for many years. They've developed their, I think it's called the Mir system in Russia. It's similar to the Chinese SIPS system, or KIPS, I don't know how to pronounce that, or similar to SWIFT in the West. And a lot of countries have their own payment systems. But the Russians wanted to use BRICS to get a kind of international one that, because of BRICS membership, would have some weight behind it and could therefore become used. And Badra Kumar has been saying that, actually, no, the Indians had prevented that specifically because they didn't want to be antagonistic to the West. Well, here comes the orange bull in a china shop, bullying the Indians, pressing them. And, well, things are changing. And I think, I read a really interesting article on Naked Capitalism about this over lunchtime today. And it seems that the Indians are quite offended and quite outraged by this, because the Americans themselves have trade with Russia. Americans buy both uranium and palladium from Russia because there are no other alternatives for America. Well, the Indians might say there are no other alternatives for us when it comes to cheap oil, and we're a much poorer country than you. We would struggle to take that hit, and you would struggle much less to take the hit. And the Indians are making this point diplomatically. So, oh, by the way, I should add here that I read Ben Aris, who said that he, about 6 months ago, had spoken to his contacts within India. Ben Aris is a journalist, and he writes, and he's the editor of an emerging markets business intelligence journal called BNE Intelligencer. And Aris said that his contacts in India had said that antagonism toward the US in elite and business circles in India was already starting to grow because of what was seen as its high-handed behavior when it came to the Ukraine war, and when it came to China, and when it came to trying to force India to pick sides, because India is traditionally a multi-aligned or multipolar or non-aligned nation, and it's always sought to stay out of alliances, and it's sought to maintain good relations with all of the great powers. It's seen itself as kind of a neutral actor in that sense. And Iris said that things were getting bad 6 months ago, but now Trump is starting to push this. The likelihood is that India, because of its long-standing policy of, as I say, non-alignment or multi-alignment, will not go fully into the Russia-China camp here. But this is what the US risks doing. The US risks sacrificing, slowly drawing India into its orbit and pushing it away from China. We're sacrificing that on the altar of what's happening in Ukraine. It risks sacrificing that on the altar of trying to get India to be antagonistic towards Beijing, right? And I think this is important. Like, these actions have consequences. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about how introducing tariffs was going to, over the long run, reduce American influence in the key Western Pacific theater. The same is happening here by really pushing India to cut its oil trade and threatening these sanctions, even as it itself trades with Russia. Is going to further antagonize the Indians, further sour relations, and further tip them towards leaning at least a little bit toward Russia and China. You might see, for instance, now a BRICS unit of exchange moves forward, a BRICS bank transfer system moves forward. You might start seeing that sort of thing. And if you do, you'll know why.
Yeah, I think India's actually kind of in a pretty bad place strategically these days. As you said, it always had this non-aligned policy, but the non-aligned policy assumed that both, like, the two sides, which were basically the West and Russia, or the Soviet Union previously, were both open to do business and were open to be, like, approached, or however you'd like to put that. And as you say, the Americans are kind of shutting that down on one side, and that kind of leaves India in a really difficult position. Any other country can go and kind of join fully into the developing markets or BRICS bloc or whatever you want to call it, but India can't, because it has this antagonistic relationship with China. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. I think it's really, really deeply felt in India. It's a nationalist thing. It's not that they couldn't put it to bed diplomatically or economically. I'd say they probably could, but it's just some hard ingrained nationalist thing, and it'll probably fade with time, but by the time it's kind of faded away, India really have lost a lot of ground. These are basically the reasons, among a few others, that I don't really think India is going to reach Chinese levels of development. I just think that they've boxed themselves in quite a bit. In terms of the BRICS, just really quickly, no one really knows what's going to happen with the BRICS, whether these kind of currency arrangements and stuff will come about. I think they definitely could. I think a lot will depend on what the West does, specifically America, as it sees the dollar going to decline. Will they just kind of like pretend it's not happening, as the British did for years, we just talked about? Will they do what the British did and find themselves in very, very difficult situations when it all starts to go wrong? Or will they grab the nettle and consider global monetary reform or something like that? It'll depend on that. If the Americans, ignore the emerging realities, then I think there's a fairly decent chance that the BRICS will move to these new payment systems and so on. But the really important thing to understand about the BRICS is that it's not so much the organization itself that's important, it's what it's come to stand for. And it's come to stand for these new trading and economic relations that are rising up as the rest of the world, the West versus the rest, we're talking about the rest of the world, starts to grow and starts to gain importance, and starts to gain in many ways more importance than the West. That's kind of what I mean by the BRICS. You can call that whatever you want. Those trade interlinkages and those mutual sources of economic growth, they'll proliferate regardless in the 21st century. And even if all the BRICS members decided that they never wanted to see each other again at those meetings, it wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, very briefly on that. Look, first of all, India's economy has grown very well. It grows at about 7% a year, which is really pretty extraordinary growth. It's outstripping Chinese growth these days, and certainly anybody in the West. But there are limits on India's economic development, and those are fairly well known and fairly well studied in academic circles. They have to do with issues like caste system, levels of education, levels of nutrition even. And obviously the standard issue with emerging economies, such as logistics and infrastructure and all the rest of it. But, they are at present growing very quickly. But, I would say regarding the Indian economy that One of the big hopes of the US corporate sector was that, okay, what we can do is we can de-risk from China, because we kind of see the administration's view, the general view on China, that it's now a geopolitical rival of the US. And the US might be taking some pretty tough and pretty spicy measures against China in the coming decade or so. It might even turn into a war. So, yeah, we're going to have to go on with this. We're going to have to de-risk from China. But we're going to stick with the same policy of offshoring. We're going to stick to moving to where labor is cheapest. And India was one of the prime candidates for that. And indeed, I think I'm right in saying that Apple have shifted something like 20 or 25% of their phone manufacture to India now. Okay? Well, again, here comes the orange bull in a china shop, and that's going to be a problem now as well. I don't know whether these tariffs are going to go through, because even if India and China stopped buying Russian oil, that would cause a great deal of disturbance in the oil market. You might get sudden spikes in prices. That would be a nightmare for the US as well. It would be inflationary all around the world. It would be economically contractionary. It would contract economies all around the world. But can he back down? Now he's gone on like this. Who knows what's going to happen? But the key is that kind of like India as the new China for offshoring manufacturing trade, that now increasingly looks like it's down the toilet. Meanwhile, the India as part of the Quad, as somebody who the US can charm, that they can softly bring into their orbit, who they can sell F-35s to, and by doing that, leverage some more arms sales, and then by doing that, leverage India into doing what America says. Otherwise, you don't get any spare parts or servicing, or we turn off the computers remotely, or whatever other stuff they do. That trade looks as if it's dead as well now. This is the cost of pursuing a war in a peripheral theatre, I guess we all have to say. Hello there, Andy Collingwood here to remind you that once a month, Multipolarity releases a special episode exclusively for our Patreon subscribers. These special episodes often involve deeper dives and longer listens, and it makes them extremely popular, and we always get a lot of great feedback about them. Amazingly, you can get access to them for only £5, dollars or euros a month. And how much is that these days? I think it's less than my wife pays for a coffee in a big paper cup to drink on the way to work in the mornings. So go to Patreon, type in Multipolarity the podcast and sign up. When you do, you'll get the full back catalogue and all the future special episodes. You can cancel at any time, but nobody ever does because it's a blinding deal. So, sign up, pay some money, get a great deal. Now, back to the show. AliBaba for AliBaba.
So, nothing concrete has happened in Iran, but there's rumors now swirling pretty rapidly. I think they're coming from Israeli press sources, probably Israeli Defense Force sources, that it looks like Iran will probably try and get Chinese air defense systems. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. Does it mean kind of the Chinese version of Patriots or S-400 systems, the Russian version? Or does it mean one of these kind of integrated air defense systems with new planes and AWACS systems and all that we saw actually going back to India and on the Pakistani side of the Indian-Pakistan conflict a few months ago or a few weeks ago? We don't know. If I were to make a guess, I'd say it's probably the ground-based systems, just because I can't see the Iranians getting trained up on the other systems very quickly. That seems to me to be a multi-year project. Whereas if they're already familiar basically with ground-based systems, I think that they could probably learn to use them quite easily. It's a long-running debate on this show whether you need the air-based systems or the ground-based systems, but what I would definitely concede pretty easily is that having the AWACS system up in the air, the big flying radar center, is definitely going to give you more reach, whether it's for your ground systems or for your airline systems. So maybe they'll figure out a way to put one of those up, but actually if you look at those AWACS systems, the Chinese ones are actually propeller-driven planes. Interestingly enough, not because they're more primitive than the jet versions in the West, but that they just find that they're more efficient. You don't need to fly as high with these things. You don't need to fly as fast, and they can fly for longer if they're propeller. They're also easier to repair, apparently, which is not surprising. So, assuming these rumors are true, what does it mean? Well, it basically means, as far as I can tell, if they get an integrated Chinese air defense system, the Israeli strikes, whatever they actually were, during the 12-day war will become very difficult, if not impossible. I personally think that they were air-launched cruise missile strikes for the most part. I don't think that they were bombing raids, direct bombing raids. I think that would have been too risky. But no matter which they were, if they were direct bombing raids or air-launched cruise missile attacks, those will become very difficult with long-range Chinese air defense in place. Obviously, if you're running a bombing raid, the air defense can just whack you out of the sky. But even if you're doing an air-launched cruise missile, you have to fly up to a certain distance and then launch the cruise missile. And modern air defense systems are built with that in mind, obviously. That's why if you look at the Ukraine war, neither side dared engage in bombing runs. They were doing these air-launched cruise missile launches at each other. And then as Russia attrited Ukrainian air defense, they started using glide bombs, which are very similar to cruise missile launches, technically speaking. But obviously the glide bomb can't go nearly as far because it doesn't have an engine, it's just gliding. Or maybe it has a very small propeller. I don't know if they use them. But that's basically how modern bombing works when you're dealing with air defense systems. And it will become very, very difficult, I think, for Israel to strike anywhere inside Iran, which, as we always point out when we talk about these things, a very, very large country. To my mind, if they do get this Chinese air defense system up and running, it will be a direct response to the initial attack in the 12-day war, and it'll render any future attacks of that sort impossible, unless Israel develops some sort of offensive ballistic missile capacity. But again, such a program would take absolutely years, and in fact, Israel will be starting from complete scratch because where would they get the models from? America doesn't have decent ballistic missile capacity. I guess they could try and buy them from the Russians. I don't think they'd get them, and I don't think they'd get them from the Chinese. The only two other countries with these programs are North Korea and Iran. So that would probably take a while, to say the least. So to my mind, what's happened here is that Israel have effectively boxed themselves in strategically on the Iran question. I really don't see any alternative to this. And even if they launch another bombing campaign in anticipation of Iran getting these systems, I just don't see what it'll achieve. It'll just push them even harder to get the systems. So I think they've kind of boxed themselves in that. To my mind, the 12-day war on the Israeli side was a one and done. You got one shot at that, really, and you want to make your presence felt in those first few days. Of course, they did hit things, but I don't think they knocked out Iran in any meaningful sense. The other development for the Israelis that doesn't look particularly good to me is the massive sea change in American views of Israel. I think this crept up on a lot of people, definitely crept up on me. I did expect views to change on Israel over the long term, probably a demographic issue, basically. The younger Jewish Americans are much less motivated to support Israel than their older counterparts. I just know that from living there. I used to live in Boston, which has a lot of Jewish Americans in it, and it's just a very noticeable trend among the younger people. And by younger people, I mean under 45, I don't mean under 25. But this has sped up enormously. A Pew survey recently showed that negative views of Israel in the United States have risen from 42% of the population in 2022 to 53%. So it's an 11-point move, and it puts it over the majority line. Republicans are moving their views on Israel. So the overall Republican leaning has gone from 27% unfavorable to 37%. And almost all of that, well, 4 points or so is from over 50, but almost all of it is younger people. So 18 to 49, disapproval of Israel has gone from 35 to a full 50%. So half of younger Republicans have a negative view of Israel. I mean, the Democratic lean has gone up immeasurably from 53 to 69%. So it's a super majority now disapprove of Israel. But all the movement there, interestingly, some of it's been in the young people, most of it's been in the older 50s. So I guess what's happened is that there were these baby boomer Gen X, late Gen X or baby boomer Democrats that still, I guess, kind of remember, Bill Clinton's broad support of Israel and so on. And they've changed their mind on it. And I mean, that's gone from 43% of over 50s, so a minority over 50s, Democrats had a negative view of Israel to 66%. Again, a supermajority, basically, over two-thirds, over two-thirds. And you could say a lot about what's driven this. The short answer, I think everybody's watching knows, it's the proliferation of online media. It's also the events themselves and so on. But this is boxing in Israel too. I mean, look, if I were an Israeli policymaker reading these polls, I'd have the view that the support that I currently enjoy for the Trump administration may be the last full-throated support for Israel in American politics ever, maybe. And America might, considering these numbers, even actually begin to have negative relations with Israel over time. I'm sure that's how they're reading this stuff in Tel Aviv. The Israelis are very astute politically. They're very, very tuned into their relationship with the United States. So I'm sure they read it the same way. And so you can't really come away from it with any other conclusion except that the Israelis are not only looking boxed in strategically in the region. Iran's the main rival. The rest of the powers around there are more so kind of annoyances, from Hezbollah to Hamas and all these. I mean, they're dangerous, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't want them on my border, but they're not not even existential threat, but they're not peer competitors, let's put it that way. So I'm sure they're feeling that they're increasingly boxed in with the Iran situation. Meanwhile, their key ally in the United States is turning on them. I haven't even mentioned the fact that a few European countries are now turning to recognize the state of Palestine. One of them being Britain, actually, because Keir Starmer is so scared of this Corbyn movement that we were talking about earlier. So that kind of ties back to the previous thing. But overall, I think, if I were in Israel right now, I'd say, what's the plan here? We've been through nearly 2 years of conflict now. And it's been a consistent moving goalpost. So it was like, first of all, we'll just go into Iran to sort out Hamas. Then we're going up to Lebanon. Then there's something going on in Syria. And all the time, like, they said they'd never cross this line. We'll never go to war with Hezbollah. That will be too much. We'll never go to war with Iran. And then the line's crossed, and then they do that. And then, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now it's got to the point where all the lines have been effectively crossed. I think that they've spent the capital that they had, basically political, in the US, and military against Iran. And what's there to show for it? I mean, maybe there's some grand plan in the cards that I don't fully understand, but it genuinely looks to me like Israel went on a 2-year spend of not all, but the majority, of its military and political capital, and the situation for them does not look more stable to me than it did pre-October 7th. Does it look less stable? Debatable. I mean, if the Iranians have Chinese air defense, I guess, yeah, probably slightly less stable in theory. But it just doesn't look any more stable. It's an interesting moment. I'm actually genuinely interested to see what Israel's next move is. I usually had a good sense. I was like, well, they'll probably escalate a bit more there. They'll escalate a bit more there. But I'm at the point now where I actually don't know what their next move is, and without trying to sound too arrogant, as if I have all the information available to policymakers in Tel Aviv, my guess would be that the Israelis don't know what their next move is going to be.
Yeah, so the situation with Iran, I think, is, it's fairly well known that Iran and Pakistan many years ago went to see the Chinese, and the Chinese offered both countries a full suite air defense system, which involved surface-to-air missiles for anti-access area denial purposes, AWACS planes, and fighter jets, and to integrate them all and to provide training and all of the rest. Pakistan accepted the offer, and although India did better than widely expected in their recent short air war, can't get away from the fact that Pakistan shot down at least one of Europe's most premium fighter jets with Europe's most premium air-to-air missile loaded onto it. And at the same time, Iran said no, because Iran was wary of being dragged in too far into China's orbit, because it tended to pursue something like a great power policy, but on a smaller scale, it wanted to maintain full room for sovereign maneuver. But obviously now that Israel attacked Iran, now that it sabotaged much of its air defense, that which there was, because we're now and the understanding that Iran didn't have a fully integrated air defense system, and that which there was largely sabotaged by Israel. And now that Israel attacked over 12 days and did a lot of damage to the country's, at least its hierarchy, its political and military hierarchy, many were assassinated. Then you had the Americans fly over and hammer one of Iran's nuclear facilities. Well, now it's clear what Iran needs to do. First of all, it's obvious from the Iranian perspective, at least, that they're going to need a nuclear weapon as the ultimate failsafe, as the ultimate deterrent against further kind of aggression like this. But to develop that nuclear weapon, to be able to do that, they're going to have to be able to defend their airspace. So it's obvious that they're going to go to the Chinese and say, hey, you know that offer that you made to us and the Pakistanis a decade or half a decade or so ago? Yeah, we're going to accept that now. So we're going to buy in all of the air defense systems. And then once we've got them up and running, we're all trained on them, then we'll buy the AWACS. And then once we're up and running with that, then we'll buy the modern fighter jets with those missiles that can shoot down premium Western fourth generation fighter jets from 200 kilometers away in a beyond visual range air battle. That's what we want as well. Okay. And once they have that, it becomes much more difficult, like not just a bit, but like more difficult by an order of magnitude, by the square or the cube, or than it was before to attack Iran. Right. But that's what they're doing. Now, strategically, they have also suffered some losses. We can't get around that. Syria is now under the control of the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, but that's a very weak regime, and the country's in the process of being carved up by Turkey and Israel. Okay? And losing Syria to that extent means that they have at least partially lost Lebanon as well, because they can't provide Hezbollah to the same extent as they did. And anyway, the Israelis have degraded somewhat Hezbollah's leadership, so that's going to take some time to recoalesce. Hamas has also been battered. Of course, they still exist, but they don't have the same power and strength as they did. And in return for that, those losses have been partly mitigated by the emergence of the Houthis as a serious player, people who can cause serious strategic harm to Western powers, which they are in fact doing to this day, because the Red Sea and therefore the Suez Canal is still largely closed to freight going to and from Europe and the US. So that's the current state of play with Iran. Ordinarily, I think what Israel would do is they would seek to constantly buy themselves time. Okay, we're not going to completely smash Egypt and Syria in this 6-day war, but we're going to put them off for a good many years. The same with the Yom Kippur War. The same with the wars in 83. And I think, what they'd hoped to do this time was really give themselves a period of regional military strategic preeminence. And I'm not sure it's altogether worked, to be honest, because as I say, Iran will take some time to regenerate. But once it does, it's going to be a much tougher nut to crack than it was. And, as soon as it's got that air defense set up, and especially as soon as it's got the air defense plus nuclear weapons, that's going to be a problem. How do you deal with it funding the Houthis even more then? How do you deal with it generating new proxies, bordering Israel? That's a big problem. And you're right in saying that this might be the last, once the boomers start dying off seriously, that might be it in terms of Israel's support from the US, which is a matter of true strategic importance for them. So they might only have until 2050 to get this solved. And I think from a strategic position, 25 years is next to nothing, is it?